have a confession to make. I am terrified of octopuses.
We'll go with vampire. That'll be safer.
I think what I have learned is that I enjoy vampires when they're gay.
Octopus fact time.
Octopus facts!
I mean, that's what we do on this podcast. We just like make stuff up with a good argument.
We are the octopus, and the octopus is us.
In the face of horror, we often default to being normal about it.
I mean, how many times have either of us watched a film or something and like identified with the monster?
Is it spooky? Is there a castle? Did a woman faint? Ah, it must be gothic.
Metaphors and pretty sentences and like, you know, a giant monster at the end.
Welcome to The Vampire and the Octopus.
A series by Book Club with Julia.
And Victoria.
Two podcasters who have spent ridiculous, and I mean ridiculous amounts of energy reading every single vampire and or octopus book that exists, which they really didn't need to do. But here we are.
And we'd like to be your book friends. This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
And this week, we're kicking off our new series with a bit of an anthology episode of octopus literature as a whole, with me at the helm, before we dive into specific octopus books at a later date, more in our usual episode style. And then next episode, Victoria is gonna take the reins with a sort of overview of vampire literature. It's gonna be a hell of a time.
I don't know if there's spoiler warnings. I feel like this is almost the opposite of spoiler warnings. Like, if you want to be even more prepared to go read books about octopuses, this is the place for you, for octopus and squid-related book content. The niche you didn't know you needed in your life.
Before we really dive into our octopus discussion, if you'd like to support the show, you can rate, review, subscribe on any podcast platforms. If you leave a review, we will read it on here, and we will thank you and have a little party for ourselves. We love reading those.
Unless you write mean things, then we might read it and make fun of you.
We have done that before. Additionally, if you are buying some books and want to not shop online at Amazon, you can go to our affiliate page at bookshop.org through any of the book links in the show notes, and we will get a very small kickback. And then if you'd like to join the club, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. For this series in particular, we did a ton of research for this series, and only like a fraction of it is making it on this show. Like, we both have like 25-page documents full of like so much stuff that isn't even everything we've read. Like, it's ridiculous. But we have a lot of thoughts on all that stuff. And so we're going to be releasing it as bonus content in various forms for our book club members on our Buy Me a Coffee page. So keep an eye out for that. And if you'd like, you know, if you're a vampire girly or an octopus girly and you'd like to get all the tea, that will be where it is. Especially the books that we really didn't like. I think we'll do some content about that in particular because we have thoughts. There's a lot of bad books out there.
Oh yeah. And when you're trying to read all of it, you come across some very interesting examples.
So we'd love to see you there. So as to kind of get us started and set the stage here, how would you describe your relationship with like the idea of the octopus? Has it changed over time? What do you feel like has influenced that change?
When you sent me this question, I was just like, did I have any conscious thought of octopuses before the year of like 2018? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I probably just didn't really think about them. I do remember as a young adult was served octopus at a restaurant, and it was the very first time I'd had octopus, and it was truly like a tentacle on a plate kind of deal. It wasn't like, you know, if you have like lobster mac and cheese and like hidden among the noodles are pieces of lobster, this was just like tentacle on a plate. It was good, but also I was like horrified by it. And the texture of, I'm so sorry for the vegans out there, as I describe the texture of eating an octopus. The tentacle itself was, I thought like, oh, okay, this reminds me of other meat from the ocean that I've eaten. The suckers were what really threw me. And I was like, oh, I don't know about this. And it was probably the first animal that I ate that I was like, I don't think I want to do that again.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I was aware enough of octopuses that maybe there was an element of like, these are really smart creatures. I'm not sure if I want to eat it. No, I'm a giant hypocrite because I do eat other very smart creatures.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was like the first time I felt like I had an opinion about octopus, which was I did not hate eating it, but I don't really want to eat it again, to the point that it would like come up on a restaurant menu and people be like, oh, you eat fish, right? And I'm like, I don't eat octopus. Just specifically not that one. As far as like books and like octopus in culture, it wasn't until we read The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery for the podcast that I felt like I was like in it, that I was like aware. I learned so much in that book about octopuses. I finally learned that I could say octopuses and not octopi, and that kind of set me. I mean, I read it during COVID, so I remember just like laying on my bed in like the doldrums of unemployment, watching videos at like 2 a.m. of octopuses at the New England Aquarium.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was so cool. But I kind of fell off a little bit. But TikTok does know that we are planning this episode because it keeps giving me octopus videos. And I had a question back to you, is last time we did an octopus episode, The Soul of an Octopus, you said you don't like watching them. Like, you don't want to see them in videos and stuff. Do you still feel that way?
I think it's eased up a little. I think I needed enough positive experiences to sort of replace. There's this very visceral memory the first time I went to the Morro Bay Aquarium, where there was this kind of small glass case. It was probably very inhumane to keep an octopus in this small of a case. And there was an octopus with all of its legs just like plastered up against the glass. And so you couldn't see like the eyes or the face or, the head or anything, the mantle, the body, whatever. It's just boom, tentacles. And I walked in and it just like freaked me out so much. And I wasn't very old. Yeah, I have a very visceral reaction to certain creatures. And I think also watching 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea when I was very young also really freaked me out. That's why I feel like the octopus makes a very good monster for me, because to some people they're not really a monster, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today, because it's like, it's such a great sort of creature and character and symbol, because it's like, it's smart, it's weird as hell, and it does genuinely scare me still, but in a way that now it feels a little more fun, because they have these kind of playful personalities, kind of the way you would like kind of an anti-hero. I feel like that's kind of how I feel about octopuses. I think also for a lot of humans, you have this very like, it's not uncanny valley, but your sort of instinctual like disgust response or something sort of goes like, what the hell is that? Because it's like, you can tell that it's really smart and it looks nothing like you and you have no frame of reference for like how to interact with it. So it feels like very, as a creature, as a symbol, feels like really ripe soil in which to develop a lot of thoughts about sense of self. What makes intelligence, what makes a human being? Like, I'm so fascinated by how different they are and how that difference can help me interact with myself differently. What's the line between me and not me? There's so many like really interesting things that it brings up. In this episode, I really want to discuss the octopus as other, capital O other, right? The thing that is decidedly not you. How the figure of the octopus is discussed in different cultures over time, and how these stories and representations can uncover, I think, the way that cultures and storytelling traditions talk about and relate to the octopus reveals so much about kind of the fundamental understandings that these cultures have with outsiders. Mm-hmm. And there is a very noticeable pattern with colonizing countries in particular. And I think you can tell a lot about a culture based on how they treat the sort of equal outsider, the equal other, where it's like, you can match me in intelligence and you are nothing like me. Someone who's very different from you. And what do you do with that difference? Do you try to understand it, or do you immediately recoil, that kind of thing? And I think the octopus serves that function really well because it has been established and related to in so many different parts of the world in very different ways. It's interesting that while there is kind of this resurgence since, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode, since 2016, there were these really formative octopus books that were published, and there's sort of been this recent explosion in octopus-themed literature and memoirs and all this kind of, and documentaries and all this thing. Octopus obsessions around the globe are about as old as humanity itself, right? This isn't like a made-up creature. This is a creature that has always existed in our purview, just maybe in the ocean, you know, so in this mysterious place that we only venture into sometimes.
It was interesting as I've been listening to your intro here. I'm realizing that when I think of like the stories about octopuses from my childhood, there's a lot of neutrality about them. Like there's enough positive octopus stories as negative as neutral. And so it's a really interesting monster because we have like a cute little squid in Finding Nemo.
Right,
like,
yeah.
Oh, you made me ink. Like it's so cute. She's absolutely adorable. And then in Finding Dory, we get a really smart octopus who like breaks out of his enclosure based on a true story. But then we also have like, you know, Pirates of the Caribbean, Kraken kind of deal. And I think other sea creatures get like always positive or always negative. Like we have so many shark movies that are trying to make sharks friendly because like the cultural narrative is sharks are enemies. Sharks are scary. But like octopuses have kind of fallen in this like, they've been monsters, but they've also been like neutralized in some ways. So I'm really curious to see other like some of the folklore around squids and octopuses that you found and how that's changed, because I can only, you know, speak to the movies of the early 2000s, 2010s that formed my childhood.
Pretty much anywhere that's like an octopus habitat has ancient octopus lore. So some of the oldest folklore we have is from like the Polynesian islands, Norway, Japan, the Tlingit peoples in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. And the overall theme is like the thing that all of them have in common is sort of awe and respect and intelligence. But how they respond to, you know, beyond that awe and respect and fear to this other intelligence is quite different. So the one that descendants of Northern Europe would be most familiar with is the kraken. And this comes from a word for a branch that has like many legs that was used to sort of hook and tow boats. So there's like a central kind of knob, and then there's like branches sticking out of it. And so that was the closest thing they could think to describe this creature with its many legs. And all of the legends are all fear-based. This is where we get the stories of a creature of the deep that takes down boats, a powerful and terrifying sea monster, something that can kill you. And what's interesting is because of its description as something with just multiple legs as its defining feature, it sort of got lumped in with like crustaceans for a while. And so it was a little unclear for a long time what it was referring to. Like, is it like a lobster or is it more of an octopus? And is it just like all cephalopods in general? Like it was very fuzzy what this thing was referring to. And so actually you'll see in certain depictions of the kraken that are trying to be based more on the Norwegian folklore, it will be more crustacean-esque.
Interesting.
Kind of a mixture of crustacean and octopus.
Okay, so this is where the line between like this is a folklore mystical creature and like an octopus really exists. Like this is where they blend for me, because I grew up with a lot of, you know, the influence of the kraken idea that you know when you learn about a mythical being and you're like, it's not real. Like from the moment you know about vampires, you're like, that's fun, it's a story.
Yeah.
I think I had to learn that like octopus as big as a kraken weren't real. Like I think it might have been like an adulthood learning of like, no, octopuses don't even get that big. Like not big enough to take down a ship. I think I was serious, even though I wasn't like afraid of them. I mean, I don't spend much time in like the North Sea, but like I've never been terrified of my boat being attacked by an octopus, but I was just like going about life definitely believing that there's huge octopuses that could like grab a boat.
Yeah.
Specifically if you are, you know, a pirate or a sailor of the 19th century. You could get sucked down.
Yeah, and I think that's why in later iterations of quote unquote the Kraken that were trying to be a bit more scientific, a lot of times they would use the giant squid instead. Because the giant squid can be that big. It can be like 25 feet long.
Holy cow. That is giant.
Yeah. Including like the length of it has 2 slightly longer tentacles that it uses to eat. So like tip to tail, not that it has a tail or a tip, but you know, full length, about like 25 feet. Yeah.
That is bigger than I thought. I thought we were like, oh yeah, these like exaggerated stories, like the cephalopods are maybe 10, 15 feet long. I was not thinking 25.
Yeah, they get really, really big. So, you know, there is this general sense of the Kraken, like they were probably referring to a giant squid, but over time, when it started being put into literature, it got lumped in with the octopus because the octopus is the one that humans can find because it lives in shallower waters. A lot of cultures eat it. The giant squid is like deep in the ocean, and so it might feel a bit more mythical. But for a while, the Kraken was synonymous with an octopus, or they didn't distinguish between an octopus and a giant squid. They just thought giant squid were giant octopus. You know, so it's like, it's all kind of muddled.
Mm-hmm.
The most fun is all the Polynesian cultures, because there's a lot of variation, obviously, right? You know, they spread across vast oceanic distances, and so over time, obviously, the individual islands, their storytelling would evolve in different directions, but there are some very common themes. All of them have the octopus as a central figure in their creation myth, in some degree. So I think it's Samoan creation myth and potentially Maori as well have the octopus as like sort of the last remnant from a previous time, a previous world where nothing else has survived except the octopus. So it's like this ancient creature. In Hawaii and Tahiti, they have octopus-based gods, often associated with guiding sea travel, but also like magic in the underworld. Generally benevolent, but kind of tricky. Tahiti, there's the octopus uses his many arms to bring up all the Polynesian islands and sort of connect them. So the octopus is like a symbol of connectivity between these very distant islands that all have a common ancestor. So lots of respect, lots of like a veneration in that particular culture. Japan is obviously very interesting. In ancient Ainu folklore, again, a lot of fear and respect for the octopus, who is usually benevolent, but still unpredictable. What's interesting is, you know, now you mostly associate octopus in Japan with, like, sexual fantasy, which started way before whatever associations you may have with it right now. It started way back with, like, block prints. The guy who created the wave block print.
Oh, yeah.
He also made the very first hentai.
That's great. Okay, to be honest, like I've known tentacle porn as the butt of a joke, but I didn't know.
Oh, it's a real thing.
Well, I figured it probably came from somewhere. I didn't know the Japanese connection, which makes all more sense.
Oh, yes. It's really interesting that, like, the octopus is so connected with sensuality and how that might be tied to eating. You see this interesting pattern where in cultures where they eat octopus, there's a slightly different, more familiar relationship. Not all of them have the sexual component, but it's more sensual, it's more, there's less fear. You know what I mean? It's like something that you're more familiar with.
Yeah.
Whereas you have something like in Nordic countries that it's only fear. It's only evil. There's this really incredible book that I will probably put more information on because I could do a whole episode on it, called The Story of Devilfish Bay. And there's one copy in all of Seattle, and there's probably very few anywhere else. It was published in the 90s by a Tlingit elder. They have a story about this particular bay where people lived in harmony with the octopus for a very long time. There was this language of, like, you know, this creature as a brother, as an equal. And then the children start taunting Knock, and it destroys their village. The language, they retaliate and they do end up killing it, but the language that they use is more that they're punishing their brother rather than like going against their enemy. There's never any enemy-based language. And then there's a bunch of extra content in this book of the author, who's really just transcribing a story they've told for a long time, right? Of this author bringing the book, the original copy of the manuscript, back to this bay. It's a real place. Blessing and saying a prayer to Knock as like a thank you, putting the manuscript in the water. So I think it's really important to emphasize before we move into the sort of center narrative of this episode, fear and hatred of the octopus, of any kind of cephalopod type creature, is not an inherently human quality. That's not an inherently human trait that you see an octopus and think it is an enemy. This is the kind of thing that's contextual and must be taught, right? And because every human seems to have a kind of instinctual reaction to the octopus that is, you know, there is an element of respect, there is an element of fear, there is an element of, wow, this thing is very intelligent and very different from me. But the then immediate reaction of, I need to destroy it or it will destroy me, this thing is evil, is not an inherently human trait, right? Those are two separate things. How you respond to this other is something you're taught. The sort of running theme throughout all these stories is that, like, the octopus has an alternative intelligence, which is equal to but not the same as humanity. And so when you learn a lot about these different cultures of what do they see when they look at an octopus, do they see food? Do they see a demon? Do they see a god? A sexual partner? In the case of Japan, they're the only ones who feel that way. And so, you know, as Americans who are descended from Europeans, right, our storytelling heritage of the octopus is the Kraken, which is fear, revulsion, demonic, eternal enemies, larger than life monster. And so it's actually interesting that there have been little bursts of octopus crazes throughout history. It sort of dies down and pops back up again, kind of in tandem with Europe's, like, colonial history and these powerful countries' relationship to their own power and to the others that they're interacting with. And so you can sort of get a look into the mindset of the people in these cultures towards these people who are different from them by looking at how they react to an octopus, how they write about an octopus, what they make the octopus symbolize. So the first one that I think is the most fascinating is there's kind of a Kraken fever, mostly France and the UK in the mid-1800s. So what image do you have of Europe in this era of, like, mid to late 1800s? What references do you have for this time period? Like, you know, what are your connections here? What are you thinking?
Well, my brain goes immediately to one of my favorite classes I took in college, which was 19th century British literature, which I thought was going to be a snooze, to be honest. And I showed up and I had a great professor. And so I think of, like, romanticism. I think of, like, that iconic painting of the man in the suit and he's looking out over the ocean as it crashes in the rocks.
Yeah!
And he's like, who am I against the great beauty of nature? And I think of Lord Byron throwing parties and people writing, you know, Gothic literature. I think of Dracula and this idea of, like, trying to figure out who we are as a people, but still very, like, Dracula, you've been talking about so much about the other. Dracula is so much a story about the other. This fear of the Eastern European in Dracula specifically. We get, like, a lot of grappling with how do we stay connected to our humanity and nature, but also living in a time of extreme industrialization and, like, now we have factories and we have ships going around the world and we're the height of, like, British Empire and there's a lot of like power and might and enthusiasm and nationalism, but there's also, I think, in the arts, this a bit of crisis of like, who are we anymore? And suddenly getting immersed with a lot of outside influence. So all the imported goods, all the money coming in, and the ability to travel other places. So when you said Kraken fever, my first thought is, yes, it's a very good rum. Everyone should be drinking it. But then I was also thinking that rum probably didn't exist in the mid-1800s. We must be talking about something else.
You set the stage perfectly. I would emphasize this is also when the division of Africa is happening, or has just happened. This is also when you get a lot of those, like, human zoos.
Oh, yeah.
Ugh. Yeah. So I found this incredible text by this guy named Henry Lee. He worked with the octopus in the one octopus they had in the London Aquarium, and he published this text in 1875. And it gives you such an incredible insight into, like, the mindset of the people at this time and what was going on. And he was trying to... There was this octopus craze, and he was like, well, I'm an octopus expert. There are only, like, 4 of us. So, total, in the English-speaking world. So I should publish a little text so that people can see what's fact and fiction and probably make a little money. And so he talks about how there was an octopus exhibited in the aquarium of Boulogne in September 1867. So I pulled a little quote that I think describes the octopus craze pretty well.
It was the prominent subject of conversation at the tables of all the hotels there, and almost the first words addressed to a newcomer were, quote, "Have you seen the devilfish? It was but a miserable little imp, only half matured in diablerie, and so persistently concealed itself by burrowing in a considerable depth of shingle, that all that could generally be seen of it was a portion of one of its arms waving gently in the water. But perhaps this was quite as well as if more had been visible, for it left a great deal to the imagination, and was also profitable to the proprietor, because people repeated their visits daily in hope of attaining a better view of it."
Isn't that so funny? Like, people would show up in this town of Boulogne just to see the octopus. And they'd be like, have you seen the octopus? Have you seen the octopus? He waved at me yesterday. Like, that's so kind of celebrity.
Yeah, I think this highlights so well, too, like the mystery of it.
Yes.
You know, like, I think some of the fear of the Kraken is if you have a giant squid grabbing onto your boat, you don't know how much more there is.
Yeah.
You don't know how big it is. And giant squids are, as I've learned today, quite large. And so, yeah, of course it's like fun and enticing, especially because this one seems to be little. And so you're like, oh, it's cute. But it's, yeah, what else could it be?
But notice, even though he's describing it in a very fun way and everyone's having a lot of fun, all of the words he uses are devil, imp, diablerie is like, you know, devilishness. He uses, his sort of default is like that this thing is evil. It's some kind of little demon, but it's very cute. And we've contained it in a little box. And everyone's ogling at it like, oh my gosh, you know, they're so fascinated by it, but also they think it's inherently evil. And that comes from a couple things. So there's a Tennyson poem. The first mention we see of a kraken in like published literature is a Tennyson poem in 1830. He describes the kraken as a polypi, which was the sort of scientific name for an octopus at the time, as a cultural symbol of like the dark side of the self. It's like burrowing and asleep in the deep. But then we have these last 3 lines here of like, until the latter fire shall heat the deep, then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise and on the surface die. And so this establishes a few things, right? Thematically, it really is referring to like the dark side of the self, but it also has the association of the kraken with the end of days of like, which you get in something like Good Omens, right? Where the kraken's gonna rise, and that means that it's like end times. So this is the first time it's sort of been published and written down as a symbol, and it holds a few things with it, that it's sleeping, it's hidden, it's dark, it's evil. And then we get Victor Hugo. You mentioned the romanticism of this time and the drama of this time and like man versus nature and all this kind of stuff. And Victor Hugo is one of those guys, right? We think of, when we think of romanticism, we think of page-long sentences, we think of drama. The man was dramatic. So he published a novel in 1866 called The Toilers of the Sea. And this is really what kicked off the octopus craze of this period. Basically, the premise is that this guy on the Guernsey Islands, where Hugo was exiled, he wants to marry this girl, and her dad says, no, you have to, basically complete the labors of Hercules, but a different version, right? And so he has to do all these tasks. And one of the things he ends up having to do is there's this very epic fight, and near the climax of the novel, with an octopus. There's an interesting shift here where it has a lot of the baggage of the Kraken and this evil hiding thing, but he's also adding some of the scientific description. He's trying to make it as realistic as possible because there is some scientific knowledge of the octopus by this point. He tries to use technical terms. So he says this animal, which mariners call pools, which science designates as cephaloptera, right, which ancient legends call krakens, right? So he's sort of drawing this very deliberate connection between octopus and the Kraken. And when I tell you, the way that he describes this octopus is truly insane.
Has this man seen an octopus?
I don't know. That's the thing. I mean, the degree, he's known for drama, but the degree of the drama, the degree of the evil is unparalleled.
Okay, these are a couple of the quotes you grabbed from Hugo. Quote, "These creatures disturb his ideas of the creator. They are hideous surprises. They are the death's head at the feast of contemplation. The philosopher determines their characteristics in dread. They are the concrete forms of evil. What attitude can he take towards this treason of creation against herself?"
Treason of creation. Concrete forms of evil. What the hell, Hugo? What are you talking about?
I think he's just going on about his writing. He's like, let me write this another way. Let me write this another way.
4 sentences saying the same thing in more increasingly dramatic styles. How about the next one?
"Every malignant creature, like every perverted intelligence, is a sphinx, a terrible sphinx, propounding a terrible riddle, the riddle of the existence of evil." What?
He basically goes on in this passage to argue that the octopus proves the existence of material hell because this creature must have come from hell.
Wild.
Oh, and then we get down here where he says, "What then is the devilfish? It is the sea vampire."
Oh.
So this is where your knowledge of vampires come in, because then he starts going off. He says, "We deny the possibility of the vampire, and the cephaloptera appears." Right? So he's like, are you scared of vampires? Do you think vampires aren't real? Where's a real vampire that exists in the ocean? Get scared, bro. He kind of said, "A kind of somber demon of the water," or it has an aspect like gangrened or scabrous flesh. It is a monstrous embodiment of disease.
It's
so intense, right?
This is so interesting, and I know, for our listeners, you'll get this in the next episode when we talk more about vampires, but this time frame, because, Bram Stoker's Dracula is 1897, so after this, but, a very similar feeling of, we need to embody evil, we need to, point at it, it needs to be in a thing. There's a very material essence of, that is evil and that is good. Yeah, it's fascinating to hear this language used on the octopus. And, he draws the parallel himself about it, how vampires are discussed, and vampires being a mythical being, it's okay, yeah, we made up something that we can, point at and be that's all the evil in the world. It's so fascinating to, do this to a creature. A creature in the ocean.
Thing.
Yeah.
And, what about it had him so repulsed? You know what I mean? Obviously he has to dramatize it for his novel to make it as scary as possible.
It's part of the story, too, that this guy is grappling and he's fighting against evil. So there's all the symbolism of, what you must overcome. I guess I haven't read this book, but based on what you said, overcome in the face of love and, pitting him against this, all-encompassing evil.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you pointed out earlier about, the sort of crisis of identity. And like the number one thing you can do to define yourself as the good guy is to create an enemy. And so it kind of feels like that's what a lot of the literature in this era is sort of grappling, is reaching for, is like, I need to create an evil. I need to, like you're saying, embody an evil. I need to put that there so that the hero of my story can be the hero and can be the embodiment of good. Especially when you're seeing your country do a lot of horrible things in your name and you're like, are we the bad guys? No, that's not possible. We are the good guys. These things must be evil. So then Lee's text that you quoted earlier was a response to this book reaching popularity and, you know, the octopus gaining this craze. There's a section of his book that is just explaining what Hugo got right and wrong. And he talks about how within the last few years, Victor Hugo brought it again into notice by the publication of his Les Travailleurs de la Mer, The Toils of the Sea. Since then, it has been constantly exhibited in aquaria, and octopus has become a household word. Argue probably just the rich people. But, you know, it became more of a common thing. And in the late 1800s up until the early 1900s, you get a lot of short stories following very similar themes where they write what I would describe as colonizer horror, right? You think of H.G. Wells, who's more famous for War of the Worlds, where he writes a very similar story to War of the Worlds, but it's called The Sea Raiders, and they're coming up from the ocean. This is in 1896. And colonizer horror is basically just, what does the colonizer have left to be afraid of? The thing that they're afraid of is the same thing that they've done to other countries being done to them. And a lot of times they have to create an alien race or a more intelligent species from the ocean to sort of rise up and oppress them the way that they have oppressed other people. It has to be, you know, superior intelligence. They give it a kind of hierarchy and such. Call of Cthulhu in particular, I had never read the text before. It was just kind of a reference point I had. This one, it's a little bit later. It's like 1928, but it is the epitome of colonizer horror. Lovecraft was like obsessed with like British lit, and he really wanted to be British. He was a white supremacist. He was kind of stuck in the past and was very inspired by these like older texts. And so Call of Cthulhu is the most racist short story you've ever read in your entire life.
Oh, no.
That's basically about this group of anthropologists who uncover this secret, quote-unquote, cult worship of this ancient figure of Cthulhu who's vaguely squid-like, who lives in the ocean. They have these really horrified reactions uncovering that this worship of Cthulhu has continued and that he is being awoken. And the people that they're afraid of waking up Cthulhu are the indigenous peoples and the misplaced peoples who have been the victim of colonization, continuing to practice their old ways of worship. And he describes them as like savages and occult versus civilized and all this, you know, all the classic words that you're like, oh my God, you can't describe people like that. He uses all of them. And it's really just colonizers being afraid of the latent power and ongoing cultural practices of the people that they have oppressed. That's the whole story. And the figure of Cthulhu is like this sleeping mass in the bottom of the sea that's sort of squid-like that will be awoken if enough people continue to worship him and will threaten, quote-unquote, civilized society. This sort of stretch from the late 1800s to the early 1900s is when we really see just the extent of the hatred of the other and the fear of the other and the way that the other was used to define Europeans and Northern Europeans and Americans as the quote-unquote good guys out of this kind of desperation. But what is interesting, there's a bright spot in this period. In 1870, so this is only a couple years after Hugo. Let me see, when was Hugo? Hugo was 1866. So 4 years later, we get the iconic text of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published by Jules Verne. He sort of provides the anti-Hugo. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is meant to mimic, I think it's very similar to Dracula in a lot of ways. It's meant to mimic like a scientific log of these people who are on the hunt for the giant squid. And again, he doesn't distinguish between kraken and squid and whatever. But one of the main characters, Captain Nemo, is canonically from India. He confirms it in a different text. He was supposed to be a Polish man who was fighting against Russian control, but his publishers advised him to change it. So he was like, okay, well, he changed it to Captain Nemo being from India, fighting against British control. And so it's not talked about much in the text itself, but that is canon, and it's an underlying theme throughout the book as sort of an extended metaphor that is meant to be anti-colonial and sort of a critique of the current world order, even if probably by today's standards we would consider it kind of racist or not going far enough. But the whole thesis of the text is essentially that the monsters should win. So it's modeled off of this kind of colonizer horror of like there's this hidden beast in the ocean that's going to tear us down. And Jules Verne is like, yeah, they should. He's like, yeah, they should come and destroy us. Because, like, what the hell are you all doing?
I'm realizing I know nothing about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I know of it as a book, but I couldn't tell you much about it. So this is fascinating.
There was a bit of a break from, like, popular prestige octopus literature during the World Wars. And then it pops up again, surprise, surprise, during the Cold War era of, like, American fundamentalism, this sort of outsider fear. But the language around it changes slightly. There's the thrillers from the 50s and 60s. There's The Kraken Wakes. That's about this sleeping alien race that lives beneath the sea. And you never actually see these creatures. It's this fear. The whole story is a fear of the silent, intelligent unknown that's hidden amongst you, kind of thing.
Very Cold War.
Very Cold War, right? All Cold War thrillers are like, there's this hidden sleeping evil amongst you kind of thing. There's a film called It Came From Beneath the Sea in 1955, where the sea becomes too radioactive from nuclear testing, and it creates this giant octopus that attacks the American naval outposts. Very similar deal. There's a bunch of sci-fi novels by Jack Vance that have this race of creatures that are like semi-intelligent, squid-like predators, but they're also aliens. So they're these silent alien race. So this is when the idea that the octopus is an alien really pops up for the first time. That you really get that in like the Cold War thriller, just to make them even more, because you can't really call them like the devil anymore. That's not very popular, but we can call them aliens, right? That's really scary. So anytime there's sort of a period of very, very strong sense of like, we have to make a very firm boundary between our identity and the other people's identity, you get this popping up of popular octopus literature. But then we get into like, there's a sort of transitional period where Kraken-related media started shifting. And I think it's important to note, this is when we're starting to get into our post-colonial era, right? A lot of revolutions, think about end of apartheid. And so there's a little more self-awareness starts popping up in these stories with the Kraken without any sort of structural change. Citizens of like the colonizer countries started writing more self-reflective work without trying to really change their actions or lifestyles very much. Ultimately, the octopus or the Kraken is still this other thing, and we are still the best, but we're just self-aware about it, and we're self-deprecating about it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But something that was happening during this era was this dude named Jacques Cousteau. Is that a name you've heard of before?
I know it as a name people say, and I nod like I know what they mean.
Yes.
I think I got him confused with Hercule Poirot for a long time until I started reading Agatha Christie, and I'm like, that is not Jacques Cousteau. I just don't know, like, French and French-Belgian names. Full stop.
Oh my god, that's amazing. Yeah, do you remember growing up, like, all 90s babies were kind of obsessed with becoming a marine biologist? Do you remember this phenomenon?
I remember this, and I I know it mostly from people my age being like, oh, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist.
Yeah.
And I know actually one person in my life who like hardcore actually did. And then even though she didn't get a degree in biology, went and like studied on a whale research boat as a volunteer for a long time. Like she like actually has that like drive of like, in another life, I would have been a marine biologist. But I don't really know where that came from, that so many kids were like, I want to be a marine biologist. And then everyone like gave up on it.
Yeah.
Maybe this is like an indictment of American like education system, that like science class wasn't interesting enough, or enough people realized that they don't live near oceans and it was going to be difficult to start their career.
That does make it challenging. I now have a theory about it, actually, from researching this Jacques Cousteau guy.
Oh, okay.
Because he has this image of being like an old school explorer of the deep ocean, but in a slightly less controlling, colonizing way. But he was a prolific science communicator. Prolific. He had so many TV shows and TV programs of like exploring. It was like him as an explorer with his exploring team learning about the ocean.
Oh, that's cool.
He had tons of little children's books on all different types of sea creatures. And he had stuff for adults too, but it was like prolific, the amount of stuff that this man made. Look at his Wikipedia page and like all his publications.
He did die 2 years after I was born, so I'm going to credit my lack of understanding to that, though I'm sure many people my age are like, but his books and TV shows lived on.
I think we just barely missed the boat.
Oh my gosh. Okay, sorry to derail, but I looked up Wikipedia Jacques Cousteau, and I'm like, this is where I got the detective correlation. The Pink Panther detective, his name is Jacques Clouseau. Inspector Clouseau.
Oh!
Because I was like, where did I get this detective connection besides
That
the fact
makes a
that
lot
I
of sense.
like, that's funny. Okay. Because I did watch a lot of Steve Martin, the Pink Panther, as a child.
That makes a lot of sense. I didn't even make that connection, actually. French names are so silly. Yeah, so I think he really popularized like marine biology and a lot of octopus research. He popularized. He still wrote about them in a kind of condescending way as like the superiority of European scientists, but it was a shift towards more compassion and more empathy, even if it was still from a superior, quote unquote, position. And so he's kind of a transitional figure, I think, in a lot of octopus writing that was super influential for like anything we've seen in the 21st century. So finally, we get to the past decade. We finally made it, right? So you mentioned that in the 2020s in particular, we read Soul of an Octopus, and it's just like everything changed from there. Like all of a sudden you see the octopus everywhere. There were 2 books published in 2016. There was The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery, which we read, and also a book called Other Minds, which is like more of a scientific philosophy of science text. It's like a post-human philosophy looking at the octopus as like an alternative and equal consciousness in order to understand our own consciousness. So Soul of an Octopus is more of a personal memoir, like interacting with the octopus to understand myself. And Other Minds is more the philosophy of science and like what is humanity, what is consciousness, that kind of stuff. Both of those were published in 2016. Mm-hmm. So like, what do we feel like was going on in the, 10 years prior to that?
You've set up this exploration of like, here's a time period of social upheaval and here's how the Kraken kind of emerged. I mean, if you think of like specifically the years between 2015 and like 2017, 18, like so much happening in America and the UK politically of these kind of identity crises, right?
Yeah.
Like we get the election of Trump in the US, we have Brexit in the UK, and there's like kind of like, who are we? Are we the other? And I think this is maybe more of a liberal response as far as maybe we're not the superior one here.
Yeah.
Meaning humans on the planet, but also extending to a lot of the political discourse happening in America when it comes to immigration and othering people. Mm-hmm. So that's what comes to mind. But of course, that's like, I might be projecting as an American living in this moment, what was happening that would spur this on. But it also kind of feels like, I don't know what spurred it on, but kind of the next step in a lot of our philosophy has been, and maybe this is more as we learn about space, we're having these big like missions to other planets, and we're doing, sci-fi's been wandering around in this world for a long time, but now some of the science is catching up as far as like, maybe we're not the only ones out here. Maybe we're not even the only beings of consciousness on this planet. And so, I mean, that was what was so interesting to me about The Soul of an Octopus, is reflecting on consciousness and thinking about maybe we're not the only ones on this planet that are thinking thoughts. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking, is like these years are not just like picked out of nowhere. There's a lot of political discourse happening. Is Other Minds an American author, British author, other author?
He is Australian, actually.
Australian, interesting. I don't know much about Australia in this time period to speak to how his culture might have influenced the philosophy he was writing about. But that's where my mind goes.
I think you're 100% right in terms of why it has gotten so big since the publication of these two books. I still don't know what sort of circumstances created the opportunity to write these two books. I'm wondering if, we're seeing kind of the after effects of a movement in marine biology in the 2000s, 2010s, where maybe octopus were a bit of a hot topic there first. And so people working in that sphere were, maybe there was finally enough to write about, and there were more practices of building relationships with octopus in a different way, a more compassionate research, potentially, and a shift in willingness to see the octopus as more of an equal. But whatever led to the publication of those two books, the response has been an explosion of octopus literature. It hasn't even been 10 years since 2016, and there are 12 like popular fiction and nonfiction texts that have been published, a good chunk of them in the last 4 years since 2020. A lot of these are 2020's publications. Not all of them in English either. Most of them are in English, but not all of them. Another thing that did a lot to really propel the octopus, particularly as a kind of deconstruction figure, was the documentary, My Octopus Teacher. Do you remember this?
Yeah, didn't win like an Oscar or something?
Yeah, I think it won Best Documentary, maybe? It was published in 2020 on Netflix, and so, like, everyone's at home having watched everything else on Netflix. And so they're like, yeah, sure, let's watch this octopus documentary. And so this, I think, was also very formative for a lot of the texts we've seen in the 2020s. It's never addressed, like, explicitly, but the story of that documentary is a white South African man who has had some kind of breakdown, midlife crisis kind of situation. The theme of the story is that him interacting with this same octopus every single day for a year changes how he lives, how he thinks about himself, how he thinks about himself in relationship to the earth, to his environment, to the people around him, and sort of shifting his entire worldview, interacting with an octopus every single day. And so there is a very, very powerful decolonization theme in terms of like decolonizing of the mind, right? He is acknowledging throughout this process that there is another type of mind like him that he can learn from, and who maybe has some things to contribute to how he understands the way that he lives his life and how he thinks about himself. Anytime someone talks about like decolonizing your mind, that's kind of what they mean, is like interacting with something that's very different from you and letting it change how you think and how you see, so that you don't fall into certain patterns of hierarchy, better or worse, me versus them, right? There's these sort of inherent structures of like anything different is evil that we've seen are kind of default in a lot of this literary history that are just not true, right? It's a cultural practice, it's a cultural story. And so something about using the octopus as a way in to unpacking and maybe throwing away some of that story can really make a big shift. So this is a quote from the introduction to, Cy Montgomery wrote like a follow-up to The Soul of an Octopus, which literally my copy just came in 2 days ago. And this is part of the introduction. So Victoria's going to read that.
I believe we are at the beginning of a revolution. We are realizing that humans are not the only beings with sophisticated minds. Demonstrations of cognitive and emotional sophistication are all around us, even in the most unexpected characters. This monumental shift in perspective provides a radically new understanding of diverse animal minds, not only helping to reshape the way we think about animals, such as the octopus, but also the way we treat them. The more we reveal the octopus's secrets, the more empathy and compassion we can feel, which in turn fuels a need to protect these enigmatic critters and their fragile ecosystems. Okay, so this is something we didn't even talk about yet, but makes so much sense reading Montgomery's piece here, is maybe another reason we've been caring more about octopuses is that climate change has been more and more conversation that more and more people are taking seriously and thinking about. And for so long, I mean, basically our entire lives, a lot of the rhetoric around why you should care appeals to our emotional connection with animals, right?
Yeah.
So it's like the Arctic is melting and the polar bears are losing their homes. The whatever tree frog has lost its habitat and there are less of them now than there used to be, or this animal is going like extinct and we'll never see it again. And so I wonder if that's also part of what has sparked this interest and fascination with octopuses, on top of what we've all already talked about like, you know, sophisticated consciousness and other minds on the planet besides us, but taking a look into the oceans. And like, we've talked a lot in our public discourse about like the coral is going away and it's terrible. And if you know a lot about coral, it's probably really heart-wrenching. But as someone like myself who knows very little, I'm like, it looks like a rock, but I know it is an animal. You know, maybe there's something about the octopus that feels almost more relatable, which is a complete 180 from previously when it's like the Kraken is the other. It is so different than us. It is now like, or like understand how close an octopus's consciousness might be to yours. Maybe not the same, but just like the same level of intelligence, a different intelligence. Imagine what that is. And now let's think about their ecosystems and what we're doing to damage them.
In certain ways, you can see the octopus as a kind of proxy for learning to empathize with people who are very different from you and to kind of put yourself in their shoes and imagine, especially because the octopus is very, is multiple in certain ways, right? Their brain is only 2/3 of their brain is in their arms. And so the relationship between, like, there is no center, there is no hierarchy, there is only community. Like, the octopus is a communal being. And that's a very, very different way of, there's no top down, there's only collective power. And so there's also something about allowing it to reshape how you think about the power structures in your life and what things you sort of assume are normal because that's the culture you've been raised in. Yeah, the octopus does so much. It carries so much weight to it, and it connects so many of the different themes that we have been sort of the center of the zeitgeist in the past 10 years, particularly the last 4 years. But it's not always executed perfectly. And we need to take a small moment to mention Remarkably Bright Creatures, because that is a book that is very hot right now, and we have feelings about it.
I know. I was like, do we save this for the bonus content? But I think it deserves to be discussed.
I think it deserves it.
So I picked up this book because I was standing in a bookstore and it was in the moment of inspiration, which I don't often have a pinpoint for. But I was like, Julia, what if we do a series where you talk about octopuses or something and I talk about vampires or something? And then we never found out if there was any better something to talk about. So we were just like, vampires, octopus, done. But I was standing there holding a copy of Remarkably Bright Things. I saw Gina Chung's Sea Change was sitting there too. And I'm like, look at all these octopus books. So anyways, this was the book that had some sort of celebrity book club sticker on it. I read the back and I'm like, oh, it's a debut author. That's really cool. Like, she hasn't published before. This is her first book. And it was fine. I think I had some higher expectations. And honestly, I was like, oh no, Julia, have we gone wrong? And she's like, don't worry, I found a lot of other octopus books. I was like, okay, because the first one I read, I was like, I'm leaving it up to you. I don't know if we want to read this one on the podcast. And no shade if you liked it. There's just like things that didn't hit me in the feels that probably did for other people. The octopus, just to focus on that part of it, was like, it didn't feel as revered as the octopus in like Cy Montgomery's nonfiction work, where after reading that, I'm like, wow, the octopus is so fascinating, so different, but like has ability to connect with humans and express emotions in a way that we can sometimes understand. And the octopus co-narrator, I guess, of the story just felt very, very much like a human pretending to be an octopus.
Yes! Yes. Okay, my frustration with it, because I was so excited that one of the narrators was an octopus. And I was like, this is an incredible opportunity to try and write from a perspective that is so different from our own. How would they refer to themselves? How would they experience the world? How would they try and relate to these much more simple creatures who only have 4 limbs and a central nervous system, right? Like, how would they try and dumb themselves down to try and communicate with this woman and whatever? And instead, all she could come up with to make this octopus seem intelligent was to write it like it was a very arrogant and condescending old British professor. Like the language, it's like that's all she could imagine. I was so disappointed, and I was like, why does it have, just because it's smart doesn't mean it has to think it's better than you? You know, like, why do we have all of these sort of subconscious associations with intelligence that we have in American culture got lumped onto this creature that didn't, it felt exactly like you were saying, it felt like a human pretending to be an octopus. And so you see the writer's hand so much, and I was like, I don't believe this. I don't believe this is an octopus at all, and it ruins the fun.
Yeah.
I just picture, like, a person in a tank with, like, snorkel gear on. Like,
wearing, like, an ill-fitting octopus costume, and you're like, wait, I thought we went to the aquarium. And you're like, it's the cheap aquarium with the fake mermaids and the fake octopus and just, yeah.
Oh, my God.
Animatronics.
Yes.
The Chuck E. Cheese version of an aquarium.
Yeah, and there's a few other examples of books that I've read in preparation for this that really miss the mark in terms of, like, using the octopus as a way to really examine humanity and self and these constructs in an interesting way and end up being harmful or condescending or boring or whatever.
But I think it's also kind of, like, par for the course. I think, like...
Yeah.
This is something we talked about off mic as far as, like, often for this show, we are seeking out, like, the best of the best books that fit our taste. And there's a lot of books we read individually and even books we've read together that we're like, it's not going to go on the podcast because it's, like,
yeah,
it's just okay. Like, we don't really want to gush about it for an hour and, like, analyze it deeply. And I think we both had this realization of, like, oh, if we limit ourselves to only reading one kind of monster, we're reading a wide range of fiction.
Yes.
You know, I might have gotten, like, a little ways into, you know, Remarkably Rare Creatures and been like, not for me, and move on. But because we were looking for octopus books, I was like, I'm gonna read it just in case Julia picks it. And then I was like, well, we'll see. I feel like it's also kind of a testament to how big this resurgence of octopus novels is, that you can list, like, 20-something novels that have come out in nonfiction books in the last 5 years, and there's just so many of them. And so with that, you're gonna get using octopus in fiction for, like, we're gonna try something different, and it's like, missed the mark for me, but, like, you know, it's not just Cy Montgomery these days.
Yeah, and I think my favorite trend that I've seen, that we'll get into more when we focus on a singular book in particular, but my favorite trend has been the use of the octopus as an empathetic figure for memoirists or first-time novelists who are themselves othered. Maybe they're the children of immigrants, maybe they're immigrants themselves, maybe they don't conform to the gender binary, or they're trans in some way, or their sexuality doesn't conform to heterosexuality, or various other, like, not fitting into these sort of binary structures that our society is obsessed with, which the octopus in turn does not fit into, but is still just as intelligent and just as formidable. That, to me, is, like, the epitome of, and I think the general trend of where we're going with octopus literature is, like, not just putting yourself from the perspective of the researcher who is looking at the octopus as the other, but looking from the perspective of the octopus, which, as poorly executed as it was, Remarkably Bright Creatures tried to do, is say, no, I am the octopus. Even think about, like, Our Flag Means Death, where Blackbeard kind of uses the Kraken figure as a way to talk about the toxic masculinity that he is trying to unlearn, and kind of that darker side of himself where he's like, I'm the Kraken. It's no longer a thing that's taking down my ship. It's me, right? So we've gone full circle, right? We're no longer fearing this evil, fearsome devil creature hidden in the depths of the ocean. We are honestly coming back right around to Tennyson, right? Of the Kraken as the dark side of the self. And the Kraken as self. But from a totally different perspective.
Right.
And one of empathy and trying to see the world in a new way and trying to live in a new way and maybe undo some of the harmful things that we've enacted on the world to devastating effect for all involved. That's the journey of the octopus so far. And I'm curious to see where it goes next. Any final thoughts? Anything you've learned today? Aside from who Jacques Cousteau is?
No, this is great. I am already, like, spinning my wheels. That's not the phrase I want. Spinning my wheels usually means that's not working. I am already churning.
Butter? Gears? Maybe the gears are turning? Is that what you're trying to say?
The gears are turning. Okay. That's what it is.
There we go.
I was like, the gears are grinding? That also sounds like my brain stopped working. Which is probably true at this point. But so I'm looking forward to which books you have selected for us to read together and how we will be able to track these themes of the other and decolonization onto, like, where we see that pop up in the books that you've selected.
I'm not going to reveal what they are in case I change my mind. All the themes will come up. Absolutely.
So now that you have laid the groundwork of octopus literature, next episode, I will be taking the reins and we will lay the framework also for vampire novels, where the vampire story comes from, how it's evolved over time, what are some of the major tropes that we will be visiting time and time again. And after that, we'll dive into some novels, and we'll let you all know what we're going to read when we've picked them out. So then we'll alternate back and forth, octopus and vampire. Yes, we named the series The Vampire and the Octopus, but the octopus came first because Julia was ready first.
We'll see you guys next time.
Yeah. Happy reading. This has been an episode of The Vampire and the Octopus, a special series from Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Thanks for listening, and thank you to our members who keep the show going. You can support the show and also receive access to exclusive bonus content, including our film club, newsletters, and archive of the first 50 episodes of the show at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjb. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, and Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Thublin. We want to know what you're reading and your bookish thoughts, so you can reach us at our website, bookclubwithjb.com, on Instagram at bookclubwithjb, or by leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. We'll catch you next time. Happy reading.